righty, we can go ahead and get started. So, hello everyone. I'm Chelsea Hutbaker with NeighborWorks Great Falls, and I am going to be the room host for this session. We're excited to have you joining us today. We ask that you mute your lines and use the chat function for all questions. So I'll try and address all the questions before the end of the session, and we'll kind of do that intermittently throughout. So just a few housekeeping items. All sessions are being recorded, and we ask that you mute your lines and turn off your video while the presenters are presenting. Click the chat icon, select all panelists and attendees, and enter your name, organization, and location. You may turn your video back on during the Q&A times. Each of you should have received a whiteboard paddle and a marker in the mail. If you find something inspiring, exciting, or new, write a quick adjective on the whiteboard. You can hold it up and let us know during the Q&A time at the end of the session. So at this time, I will go ahead and turn it over to Bret, who will be introducing the panelists this morning.
Thank you, Chelsea. Good morning, everyone. My name is Bret Downey. I run the Great Falls Development Authority. We're an economic development certified community development financial institution. We're based in Great Falls, and we focus on the Great Falls trade area, which is essentially the Golden Triangle of Montana. One of the reasons that we got involved in housing is that we have this dream that we can grow and strengthen our economy, create economic opportunity for residents, but also keep our cost of living affordable. We use a simple measure that looks at cost of living versus average wage. And we know it's an average. It's kind of like the Dow. It doesn't mean a whole lot. We dig into all of the data, but the simple measure is that when we started out, our average wage was 67% of the national average, and our cost of living was 93% of the national average. And that huge gap between wages and cost of living put severe pressure on residents, families, schools, government, healthcare, et cetera. So what we've been trying to do is to shrink that gap, and we have made progress. We're at 74% of the national average in wages, and our cost of living has actually come down to 89.5%. We still have a long way to go. We've seen so many communities throughout the West and elsewhere that housing prices have outpaced wage growth. Some people are doing quite well in those communities, but a lot of people are actually falling further behind. And that's one of the biggest concerns in economic development is, are we creating opportunities for everyone in the community, not just a portion of our residents? So we've been trying to do some creative things that we're going to talk about today. And I put together this panel because there's three of my favorite people on here who have really been doing some creative things to help us try to stay ahead of the curve in Great Falls. We have had some successes that we like to talk about, but we still have many of the same challenges that I'm sure all of you are dealing with in your areas. So I'm going to ask each of our panelists to briefly introduce themselves, and then we'll get in. This is intended to be an interactive panel, so I hope that you interrupt us and ask questions. We don't have PowerPoints, we don't have fancy photos and things like that. We want you to come to Great Falls and look at these projects. We're happy to host you, but we really want this to be a good takeaway session that we all learn from each other and try to figure out this big puzzle that's the housing market. So Craig, would you like to start out and introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Craig Raymond. I'm the Director of Planning and Community Development here for the City of Great Falls, and I've been with the city for about 10 years.
Thank you, Craig. Sherrie?
Yeah, great. I'm Sherrie Arey. I'm the Executive Director for NeighborWorks Great Falls. And for those unfamiliar with the NeighborWorks organization, we're an independent organization that's a part of a network of over 240 NeighborWorks organizations that try to help advocate for and create housing people can afford.
Thank you, Sherrie. Pat?
Hey, everybody. My name is Pat Corrick, and I'm with Farran Realty Partners. We started the company in the early 2000s and have completed about 1,050 apartment units around the state of Montana over the past 10 years. And, my business partner, Jim McLeod, grew up in the real estate business in Butte. I grew up in Missoula. Jim went to school at the University of Montana, and I went to school at Montana State. So we have, a lot of connections throughout the state of Montana, and it's just kind of a quick overview of our company.
Thank you, Pat.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to start out with a first question for all of us, and then we can dig into it. So first question is, what role does your organization have in fostering the production of quality housing in Great Falls? And Sherrie, I think I'll ask you to go first.
Great. As I said earlier, we've been around Great Falls for 40 years, and we were founded basically through a partnership of concerned community members and city because they saw how the downtown area was really becoming more dilapidated and more blight. And so over the last 40 years, we've helped reinvigorate and create some vibrant communities, particularly in our downtown north and south side. So through a lot of our programs, we've helped create homeowners, over 2,000 homeowners through the homeownership journey. But specifically, we've been able to build 43 homes through our high school house program, over 400 new homes built or renovated. And we do a owner build program that we've built over 145 homes through the USDA Rural Development self-help program. And so over the course of 40 years, we've really we've evolved. We try to respond to the needs of the times and the needs of the community, and we've kept that that partnership and that idea of who are our stakeholders in the community that can help us create opportunities for quality homes.
Now, in addition to home ownership, NeighborWorks Great Falls has recently moved into rental production.
That is a very good point. Several years ago, again, really responding to the needs of our community and seeing what's happening, we did start our multifamily programs and began to build apartments, and we've even purchased a few. And so we continue to work on that. I think later on in the presentation, we'll talk a little bit more about what that partnership needed to take for us to be able to build Rockcrest, a tax credit project that was one of the first of its kind in Montana.
Thank you, Sherrie. Pat?
Yeah, so back in 2014, 2015, we constructed Talus, which is located off of 26th near Benefice, basically. And so, it ended up being, we built Talus in 2 phases. It was a total of, or is a total of 288 units in the project. And, we love the location. We liked, being the proximity to Benefice, to Malmstrom, et cetera, and 10th Avenue. So, that's really, and we've started another project that we're calling ARC, which is more on the north side of town over by Albertsons, just off of 3rd. And, that'll be a 216 unit project with a mix of studio 1 and 2 bedroom units. And we're a market rate developer, meaning, our market rents are not governed by, HUD requirements and or other, types of imposed rental rates, if you will. So, our objective, I guess, in building units in Great Falls is to just provide more housing options for people in Great Falls. That's really what we look at. We like the market a lot. There aren't a lot of other institutional investors or larger investors coming into the marketplace at this point, which I think will happen in the not too distant future. But we really had a good experience so far.
If I could ask all of the attendees to mute yourself, that would be great. Otherwise, we're going to get everyone's dogs talking to each other. Thank you, Pat. Craig.
Yeah, thanks, Bret. Our organization in particular, being a municipal government and then the permitting entity, we have different roles to help foster, housing as well as commercial development. Probably one of the key things I think is probably two different areas in particular. One is just being flexible or be willing to consider different zoning ideas. If we still lived back in the 80s and 70s, maybe we wouldn't have to really reconsider different ways of zoning things to help make housing affordable. But the reality is costs are going up in so many ways. You have to look at different densities and ideas and that just really haven't been traditional. And some people really resist that. Perhaps some government entities might resist that. And certainly I know that some community members resist that. And we know that just based on feedback from during public hearings and things like that. So NIMBY is a very real thing. And as we try to push, some new ideas out to the community, there's some resistance to that at times. So we, as a city government, I think it's kind of incumbent on us to at least strongly consider some of these things and help lead and push those so that people, once the projects are complete, they see, oh, well, it's maybe not as bad as I first would have thought to have some different density developments out there. So, and then the other thing, of course, that we can help with is just trying to make the entitlement and permitting process as streamlined as we can possibly make it. Common sense seemed to have left the regulatory world many years ago. So I can't really, I'm trying not to use that word too much, but yet at the same time, that's what we're attempting, is to try to make it as streamlined as possible.
Thank you, Craig. Well, I'll answer from the economic development standpoint. We started out working on housing probably 8 years ago. And it really started with downtown revitalization and looking at vacant upper floors and what was the highest and best use for those. But then it was really driven by workforce. We need to retain workforce. We need to attract workforce. We want to bring people who may have left Great Falls at some point, bring them back. We're the military center of Montana. We want as many veterans as they step out of their service in the Air Force. We want them to stay here, or if they've transferred elsewhere, to come back. So we started out in a role of doing business attraction, if you will, of targeting housing production and reaching out and saying we need types of housing, and reaching out to developers. And that's how we connected with the Farran group in Missoula. And then we treat housing production similar to when we're working with a business startup or a business expansion or attraction, in providing what we call concierge services, which is essentially whatever the client needs to move the project along. So we may help connect them with equity sources or with partners. We may take people out to dinner to get them to buy tax credits. We might testify and try to build support if there's some land use approval difficulties. But just trying to see things through, move projects along. So many projects don't move forward to fulfillment because there's so many challenges along the way. And then the third thing is we are a CDFI. We've long time used gap financing to help businesses to get the capital that they've needed that conventional lenders, our banks and credit unions, can't provide, filling that gap between the available equity they have and what the conventional lenders can do. And so we decided, well, we can take that same role and do that for housing production in terms of bridge and gap financing. And I'll talk about some of those projects, but those are the three roles that have worked well for us so far. We are moving into a fourth role in partnership with NeighborWorks Great Falls and the Great Falls Realtors Association, which is to commission some market analysis to help prove some development opportunities for housing production at all price points and all different types of housing. And we're hoping that will prove some market support that then will be valuable for us to go to local developers and developers elsewhere to get them to look at opportunities in Great Falls to produce more housing. One area our organization is particularly interested in right now is in home ownership opportunity in the large donut hole, if you will, between what NeighborWorks Great Falls has been producing in terms of price point and what our home builders have been producing. In our market, there's a big gap in the $175,000 to $275,000 price range. And that's going to take some really creative developers to try and come up with some type of home ownership opportunity that will fit in those price points. But when we look at our wage rates, that's a lot of our workforce housing. So the second question I have, and for those who joined us late, if you could type in your name and affiliation in the chat box, and then start asking us questions, because we want this to be as interactive as possible, and you don't have to wait till the end. So just chat them in there, and Chelsea's watching the chat box. So the second question I have is, could you describe one or more creative partnerships you've been involved in to help produce housing in Great Falls? And Pat, you want to go first on that?
Yeah, you bet, Bret. So when we started Talus, or started looking at the financing Talus and design and whatnot, we were approached essentially by you in the GFDA with which what turned out to be a very attractive proposition, which was the GFDA brought a little over $2 million to the table in terms of mezzanine funding for the project. And what mezzanine funding is, it's gap funding. So it kind of sits between the equity in the project and the senior debt on the project, or the construction loan. And so it fills that gap. And we were, at a point where if we brought more equity into the project, our overall project returns, were not that attractive at Talus. And so having the mezzanine funding come in from the GFDA, really made the project viable economically. So, I guess I'm going to throw a little plug in here for the GFDA at this point. We work with a lot of development entities around the state, and nobody has access, meaning none of the other economic development entities have access to capital like the GFDA does. It's a wholly unique entity within the state. If you're in Billings, Missoula, fill in the blank, they encourage companies to relocate and everything else, but they don't have any capital available to support housing production. So I think that's one advantage I think the Great Falls has and the GFDA brings to the table, is the ability to actually provide funds, to both, probably the, maybe, I don't know if you participated in Rock Crest Commons or not, Bret, but, being certainly able to help create housing both on the single family side and the rental side is, it's very strong.
Thanks, Pat. Well, it was a different role for economic development, but I learned economic development in New England that really started out of the community development movement there. There are CDCs all throughout Boston and communities surrounding it. So getting involved in housing was a natural from my standpoint, and our investors and board certainly agreed that housing was a key component of our economic development strategy. And I think over the last 7-8 years, every year it becomes a more important part of our strategy. What it did force us to do on the financing side was to diversify our sources of loan capital. We had started out lending back in the mid-90s with an economic development administration grant that we partnered with the city of Great Falls to get. And some of those traditional economic development sources of loan capital just don't work well for housing projects. They're intended to help businesses. So becoming a CDFI was certainly a big part of that, and we've received tremendous support from the CDFI fund at the U.S. Treasury, and I'll make a plug for that. I think we need many more CDFIs throughout the state. But it's also been very good for our organization because financing is something that typically pays for itself, and there's very little that you do in economic development that pays for itself. Usually it just costs money. So there's a win-win, if you will, on that side of things.
Bret, we do have a question.
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, what's the source of GFTA's financing that they make available to developers?
Well, we've used a variety of sources. The first housing project we did, we used a loan fund that the city of Great Falls helped us out with through the former tax increment financing district in downtown. When the city paid off the bond on a parking garage, a $300,000 security reserve was released, and the city gave that to us to use to seed a downtown loan fund. So we were able to take a developer who had done a great job on the ground floor of a 2-story building downtown, wanted to do the upper floor and create some really cool apartments there. So we used the downtown loan fund, and then the city came in with some CDBG loan funds to make those units possible. And it was mezzanine financing, a different scale than Talus. Since then, the gap keeps growing bigger. So our challenge always as a CDFI is getting enough loan capital to fill the gap. So we've continued to rely on the CDFI fund. We also use, we received through the state some state small business credit initiative funds. And when those were defederalized, we could then put them into housing. So we have a new round of SSBCI coming to the state, much larger than before. And we're not going to be able to use that for housing production in the first go round. But as that money gets paid back and down the road will get defederalized, 7, 8, 9 years from now, that will provide more loan capital for housing. But that is a big issue. I think we'll talk about what Pat's now calling the ARC the gap just keeps growing because projects get larger, construction budgets get larger. Loan capital is a huge issue. We're reaching out now to CDFI lenders, trying to borrow loan capital to keep being able to do more projects. Sherrie, would you like to talk about creative partnerships?
Sure. As I said earlier, NeighborWorks was really founded on a collaborative partnership, and over the years, as we've been an expert at being creative at finding ways to bring homes people can afford to Great Falls. We've done a tremendous amount of infill using the partnership with the city for CDBG funds and home funds. We've moved homes and renovated them to new locations in our downtown area. We've created the owner-built program so people could build their own homes and put the sweat equity into it. We've partnered with the high school to create the high school house program that's done 43 houses. But as we've branched out in the last several years to some larger projects, we've realized that we needed to have some bigger partners in the mix. And our first endeavor was a 12-plex First Avenue Estates, and that was really working with the city to use home funds to create a mixed income small apartment complex. And then we realized that we needed to find a bigger bang for our buck and a little bit larger scale. So our next attempt was working with GMD on a tax credit project. Now, I'm not an expert in tax credits. Hopefully anyone really interested in that was able to listen in on yesterday's session with Heather McMillan and Greg Dunfield from GMD and others to talk about the headaches with tax credit projects. But at the time that we did that, there was no combined tax credit projects in the state, and that was using a 9% tax credit along with the 4% tax credits. And what makes that interesting is 4% are a bonding, and you can do those really at any times, but the 9%, which really brings a tremendous amount of equity to the project, are competitive. And each year, the Montana Board of Housing has anywhere from 15 to 20 projects that put in a letter of intent, and they drill that down and are really only able to give, maybe 5 or 6 projects the full funding. That's why it was very encouraging this year that there was so much work around the state tax credit proposal, and very unfortunate that was vetoed, but it did get to see the light of day, and that would really become one of those positive ways to combine with the federal tax credits and having a state tax credit. But the headache that happened there, and if you listened to yesterday's session, and if you didn't get a chance to, make sure you go back and listen to that. There's a lot of risk, obviously, with a tax credit project, and finding that good partner, as we did with GMD out of Seattle, who's done a lot of excellent work throughout Montana, to really bring those type of homes that people can afford for those apartment complexes. And Rockcrest is just a beautiful example of what can be done when the city helps out, and when we really had to jump a lot of hurdles in this last year and a half. And it started out with problems with the material cost when we first hit the ground running with it. Then we ran into one of the longest, coldest winters in Great Falls. And then lo and behold, let's have a pandemic. And so it became a wonderful combined effort of everybody trying to make it come together. The city did wonderful work. We had to have some certificate of occupancies on December 31st, 2019, because we had to be able to file for the tax credits, or we were going to be in a lot of trouble. And Craig can attest to, his staff was there willing to stay as long as it took to get those done, and we were able to do that. Again, we learned a lot of lessons from that, but clearly those 4%, 9% combined projects can really go a long way in Montana. And I think more and more developers are trying to use those and find ways to make the money go farther. And that's going to be the biggest issue is now is the money just is not going to go as far as it used to go.
Well, congratulations on that project. I believe it was the first combined 4%, 9% tax credit project in the state.
Yep, it was.
Craig, do you want to talk about some creative partnerships?
Yeah, I think we've as already has been mentioned, we've been participating in some creativity along the way and through the years, as both you and Sherrie have mentioned. Because we're an entitlement community, we have direct access to certain amount of certain allocations of CDBG and home funds on an annual basis. And certainly those have been part of our program in helping with housing, and will continue to do so. Similar to GFDA, the city has the Downtown Revolving Loan Fund that is limited strictly to supporting residential projects. Is primarily in the downtown, and that tend to be renovations or taking empty upper level commercial, traditionally have been commercial buildings, but renovations of upper levels and creating residentials. We really love mixed use buildings here in our downtown. It really provides or encourages a vibrancy that I think we're all shooting for. So we've been pretty active in that, and because the primary or the initial source of funds is through HUD on that, there are some constraints as far as affordable rents during the period of affordability that some people may not necessarily favor for their particular project, but we found in other projects it really is kind of like the final piece of the puzzle that makes it happen. So we're always happy when we can put that money to good use, and that's a zero interest a loan that people really, I mean, that's about the cheapest money you can get, obviously. So that's good. Another thing that we've done to help out is using creative annexation and subdivision practices. And that primarily has benefited NeighborWorks as they've been getting USDA RD funding as opposed to having to compete for urban funds. There's really some people really don't necessarily feel like that we should be in that program of doing the annexation and subdivision process that way, but we've just felt like this is one way that the city can really help, and it's to this point it's withstood scrutiny. It's a little bit risky. There's always risk, as Sherrie had said, but we've been willing to do it. But it can be messy. It's not necessarily always convenient, but it's just one way that we can partner with organizations like NeighborWorks to make things happen. Another thing that the city has done on occasion when we're able to do so is direct investment in infrastructure extension when it serves a greater basin or region. It's not something we do often. We can't afford to do it very often, but two of the subdivisions that we have on the north end, the city invested a little over $1 million in a sewer lift station and force main. And we were able to do that because it not only serves those two subdivisions, but also a much bigger basin. And we figured out through development agreements how to set up reimbursements for that. So I wouldn't necessarily call it impact fees per se. It's a little more of a direct investment and reimbursement type process. But definitely that's a creative partnership and helping with those two subdivisions. And those are, those could be done in market rate subdivisions, or even, initially NeighborWorks was involved with one of the primary developers of those areas. So it could even be things like the self-help program that can benefit from practices like that.
You know, we all like simple projects that have few moving pieces, but to get a lot of these projects done, you have to bring in all kinds of different tools. And I think one of the things we've been good at is I call it adding more tools to the toolbox. So in addition to what we've talked about, we've had our downtown business improvement district has done some housing grants to really spur upper floor housing, and they're not huge amounts of money, but it certainly does help close that gap and make things viable. We have a brownfield program in partnership with EPA that we can provide hazardous waste assessments of properties that developers, when they're in that, you know how precious the early stage pre-development money is. And we can do brownfield loans at a very low interest rate and give grants to nonprofit and public entities to, again, help close that gap. We have an opportunity fund. Part of downtown Great Falls, about 2/3 of it is in an opportunity fund. And we have a local fund that is formed that is taking upper floors above the Mighty Mo brewery and creating some beautiful loft style units. There you go. You can live above a micro brewery that also has great pizza. If I was in my early 20s, that probably would have been my dream place to live. And that same opportunity fund has proposed a new construction, over 100 units of rental housing on a riverfront property. And I know the city has been working through some difficult, potentially difficult easements and accesses and things like that. Craig, you want to talk a little bit about, we've been making good progress moving that along, dealing with a tight site.
No, I'm sorry, which project were you talking about, Bret?
The station,
Pardon me?
the station, Milwaukee station.
Okay, yeah, that actually has been going pretty well. I think we're actually in a holding and waiting pattern for them to move forward. But I think we've pretty much worked through all the easement issues as far as I know.
Yeah, well, I give you credit for it could have been an impossible site if it wasn't for some creativity in the different easements. The bids get open tomorrow, so we're keeping our fingers crossed.
I think we all are, based on prices of materials these days. So
yeah. So another question is, what have you learned from these partnerships that would be helpful for other communities? Anybody want to jump in and go first?
Well, I'll go first because I'm probably the newest one of the group. I came out of higher education and moved into housing, and I had some experience with community building and housing development for apartments for college students. But what I discovered is this Montana, the housing conference I first went to, Marine Rue did a session about fairy dust. And there is no true fairy dust, but it's being tenacious about it, is keeping with it. Even when it looks like, no, there's different ways, there's different resources. Montana has a wonderful wealth of knowledge of everyone that's here at the conference today, and then others that are not able to join us. Keep asking the questions and keep looking. You know, we've been very fortunate to have wonderful individuals that are pro-development, pro-affordable homes, and try to continue to make it happen. And from all of those kind of conversations, different things come up and make things work. We really thought we were going to shut the door on preserving some apartments in Belton Cascade until I had a conversation once again with Marine Rue that was telling me more about the Coal Trust Fund money, and we ended up becoming the first organization to be able to get those funds and purchase those properties and keep those homes affordable. And if it had not been for us continuing to try to find a way and find the yes, it could have gone into different hands and lost affordability. So this is a fantastic group of people that are always looking to find the yes.
Thanks, Sherrie. Pat?
Craig, remember that, because I'll be coming to you soon about looking for some yeses.
Yeah, Bret, I think, what we take away and what would benefit other communities is, having a group like the GFDA who has capital available. And again, as I mentioned earlier, the other development authorities in the state don't have access to those funds. So that's kind of the long and short of my response to that question.
Yeah, that's something we've certainly learned, which is being able to put, even if it's a little bit of gold on the table, it does change the relationship. It puts some community skin in the game, which is always valuable, but there's never enough capital, it seems. We won a grant from EDA last summer, 4.4 million in loan capital. In a typical year, we'd have a good year. We'd do 3, maybe 4 million in loans. Since January 1st, we've closed or issued loan commitments totaling 9.4 million. So we're in it's that constant scramble to stay ahead of the game. Craig, any thoughts for your colleagues around the state?
I think the best thing is really just to continue to try to be open-minded and to push yourself in that direction. It's easy to kind of close down when things get difficult and complicated, because things are always complicated. The easy stuff has been done. Those days are over. But also to just be willing to have, candid conversations and to really look out for each other's best interests and to make sure and communicate what your best interests are. If you're having some challenges, just to continue to talk those things through and try to find a way. Like Sherrie said, just try to find a way to yes. But in order to do that, you just really have to be willing to sit down and talk about things. So just keep an open mind.
You brought up a good point. I always tell my team, we keep a pipeline of everything, hopefully everything going on in the region, but we spend our time on the projects that are challenged, because the projects that are easy and are just happening, we're in a cheerleader row. Thank you for investing, but we only get to work on the hard stuff, because otherwise we'd just be wasting our time. Our role is to make things happen that otherwise wouldn't. I do want to mention one thing is that we never do it enough, but we've learned so much from other communities and gathering ideas. We've had some mini summits where we've brought housing developers and organizations in from other communities to talk to leaders here. We've also traveled to other communities, and we just don't do that enough. We learn so much from that. We went down, looked at a pocket neighborhood that the Boise NeighborWorks group had done, looked at things they were doing there, and stopped in Twin Falls and Idaho Falls on the way. We've been up to Alberta. We had a trip last year planned to Missoula and Spokane, but had to postpone that because of COVID. We've gone to Billings, but just learning from each other, because we're all dealing with some of the same issues.
Well, Bret, as we move into probably some more discussion, I would really be interested too, as the great people that are here today. the things that have worked in the last 10 years may not work in the next 10 years. And what are those ideas that we've dismissed thinking, oh, we don't need to do that. Now they need to come back to the table, and we really needed to consider them as the landscape of housing has changed. You know, we are, you know, is it land trusts? Are they some co-op development? You know, the manufactured homes, and where do they fall into our communities? What are the zoning regulations and the density that we need to change up, that before we really didn't want to do that or consider that? But what are the changes and the ideas in the past that we may have dismissed that now look a lot more attractive going forward? Just what are those ideas out there that Montana's seen and looking into?
Chelsea, I see you've popped up.
Yes, we have a question from Madison, and she asks, any tips on how to form relationships with the city regarding building and doing projects with their help in terms of housing developments?
Well, I'll give my perspective first. In economic development, we need a client. You're either a group that is going to go out and do its own things and be entrepreneurial, or you need a client. So you live and breathe with the client, and in this case, it's developers, for-profit and nonprofit, and you have to treat them like the very precious commodity that they are. So you find a great developer, and then you just work with them to figure out a way to how to make their project work. But without a great development entity, you're really lost. You can spin a lot of wheels and stuff, but you have to have the group that is eventually going to build the housing and then make sure it's properly managed.
So as a city person, I would just say, you know, in part, it depends on what kind of help you're asking the city for. What role are you wanting the city to play in this development? You know, if it's a conversation about re-envisioning zoning principles and regulations, that's one form of help. But if you're talking about financial help, that's a whole different thing altogether. And so really, it just depends on the type of role that you're asking the city to play. You know, first and foremost, sugar works better than vinegar. You know, but then also understand that a city organization is complex, just like many of your own. And we have multiple entities that while some in the city organization might be positive and want to help a certain initiative, there's other entities within the organization that might have challenges or problems with it or don't want to do it at all. So recognize that there can be even internal turmoil in trying to help promote an idea or a project that has to be overcome internally. And so a lot of patience is required in that sort of scenario. Also recognize that you're not the only patient in the hospital. A city has a lot of demands on it for priorities, especially when it comes to financing. And there's, you know, no lack of people looking for money and help and different things. So just recognize that you're not the only one looking for help in that regard. And again, patience is just absolutely critical on that. And just recognize that there's a lot of demands, whether it's emergency services or you know, parks, or you know, any number of things that can have a huge strain on city budgets. And also understand that if you're from another state or new to the state, every state has different tax regulations that, you know, a city either benefits from or can be hurt by. And so we don't always keep up with the rate of inflation either. And costs always go up for us as well. So that can create a pinch for municipalities. So that's my biggest thing. I think that that's what I can think of at the moment, at least.
Sherrie,
Quick-
Pat, any thoughts?
Just a quick one is like, don't take no personally. They're a complex organization. They serve many masters. And the city is definitely has the same end goal as any developer does. They may take different routes and it may be slower, but they definitely have the best interest of the city and the taxpayers in their mind. And don't assume that one project that didn't go, that's how the next one's going to work. And you got to keep knocking on the door and keep asking and be reasonable with the demands. And if the city is saying, here's the process, follow the city process. That helps with their timing. That makes things hit the right time. But if you try to swim against the tide when they say they need a month for different hearings and different things, and you miss that, you're going to be 2 months out. So my lesson is trying to figure out, make sure you're working within their process, even if you don't agree with some of the ways that you see it happening. Until you can change it, work with it.
Well, Sherrie, you had started talking about a little bit about the future and that we're going to need to revisit old things and create new things. So the last question I have for the session is for all the panelists, what creative ways do you think Great Falls can pursue to produce more housing at as wide a range of price points as possible?
I'll tackle that first. I think, as Sherrie mentioned earlier, the low-income housing tax credit, 4% and 9% options are really valid. Developing in TIF districts is another, really strong proposition, given, you can use TIF funds for potentially land acquisition and then public infrastructure, sidewalks, landscaping, things of that nature. So that's another good one. The opportunity zones, that's another great resource, and we'll see what happens with tax changes relative to 1031 investment. I think that's one of the areas that we'll see if it survives this current proposed changes in the tax law. But opportunity zones are still really valid, and I think the project that you mentioned by the old Milwaukee Depot is in an opportunity zone. So I think that's a really viable alternative. Modular and manufactured housing, I think, are two other really key components. I worked for a company in Chicago, and we were at the time the largest owner of manufactured housing communities in the country. And so, and people a lot of times think about, a 1970s single wide trailer. But the new era of manufactured and modular housing is really nice product. It's well built. It's in a factory, right? That's kind of the distinction between site built housing and modular / manufactured. And it's in a controlled environment. It's very process driven, and they're really nice homes. So I think that's another tool that the city could look to employ to create, affordability for whether it's multifamily rental product and or single family ownership. And then I think the one challenge that we've had experienced, and all of us have experienced this, is the rising prices in commodities, and particularly lumber. We think that will correct. We've seen futures in the lumber market basically limit down for the past 7 days in a row. And so you're looking at, it hasn't related into what's called the spot market, which is what you can currently buy lumber at. But the futures are trending in the right direction. Just a real quick history on that. The coming out of the recession, the timber industry, the lumber industry, basically operated on about 1.4 million residential starts per year. And that's a combination of single family houses and multifamily. And so that was pretty consistent for the next, 7-8 years coming out of the recession. And with COVID coming in, and everybody kind of put the pause on for 2 months. The mills are running at about 80% capacity right now, based on a number of factors. And so we're kicking out about 1.2 million units of lumber. And they're right now, based on housing start stats that were sent out yesterday, we're at about 140,000 a month, which translates into roughly 1.7 million starts a year. So you essentially have a 500,000 unit gap between production and demand. And it'll, there are a couple OSB plants coming online, which have been mothballed for 10 years. There's one back east, another one in British Columbia. And you don't just, throw a switch and have those facilities come online. It takes a tremendous amount of capital and energy to get those plants up and running again. But those will come online in the next, 6 months, plus or minus. That will help create, more lumber and OSB particularly. There's a fair amount of lumber coming in from Europe right now, which will benefit the East Coast more so than the West Coast. But if we can reallocate, if they use European lumber on the East Coast, that'll allow more product to be pushed toward the West Coast. The Southeast has a whole different, they're about $300 a thousand less than the West Coast right now, but they also have a lot of southern white pine, which is a heavier, more wet wood that people in the West just basically don't like to work with. The framers are they're not enthused at all about having southern white pine come into our market. So anyway, I think those are just a few of the thoughts I have on how Great Falls can continue to create good housing stock.
I know. Thank you, Pat. That's why I love you. You know your business better than anybody I know. I know Chelsea's about to pop on because we're at 11:58, and it's important to keep the conference on schedule. I do want to thank Sherrie and Craig and Pat for speaking today, but also for what they've been doing for housing in Great Falls and beyond. I'm really intrigued with manufactured housing. Before I came to Montana, I worked in rural Western Maine, and we had a little mini cluster of 5 manufactured housing plants. And the nice thing is they all had different products, so they didn't really compete with each other. One of them was the largest builder in Nantucket. They specialized in 6,000 to 8,000 square foot mansions in Nantucket. So you can use manufactured housing to do just about anything, and that could be part of the solution.
Bret, I want to make a quick plug as we wrap up here, because there's a lot of money that's going to be coming to Montana and several of our cities. And so as we continue this discussion, there is a meetup on creating a coherent housing policy in Montana at 12 that somebody named Sheila Rice is, I think, leading. So others that are still on that want to continue some of this conversation into a broader topic of a housing policy should jump onto that meetup in about 2 or 3 minutes.
I saw Sheila pop up there for a few minutes. Does anyone have a link to that? They could put it in the chat box. That would be great.
It's just in the, Chelsea, do you know how to get there from the website from the organization?
I don't have a link to that specific.
It's one of the, if you go to the community topics and it's one of the meetups, you should be able to find it.
Great. Thank you, Sherrie.
Sorry, I'm not more helpful technology that way.
Well, thanks so much, Pat, Craig, Sherrie, and Bret. And thanks so much, everyone, for joining us on the session. Remember, you can always participate in the community conversations through the Whova app to chat more. And we will now be on a 1-hour lunch break, and we look forward to having you back in the breakout session at 1 p.m. So thanks so much, everyone.
All right, thank you.
Everyone.
Take care.
Hope to see a few of you at the meetup.